Most of us who work at the front know that some patients really don't need to be in our practice. We all have opinions on this, right? They don't deserve to be there, and they really just don't do any good. They don't bring any new patients. They're terrible, hard to handle, all of that. They miss appointments, they don't pay their bills, and so on. A lot of times, the doctors are not the ones who see the bad side of the patient. It makes that even harder for them to understand that we do need to get rid of patients. And it's hard for them to accept because, in their eyes, once a patient is always a patient. But from an administrative point of view, the patient, it is the lifeblood of the practice. When you're a business owner, it really bothers you, or a business leader, really bothers you to lose one of those vital drops of lifeblood. I get it. It's like the worst breakup imaginable with no hope of reconciliation. So I totally understand. When should you absolutely terminate a patient? Welcome back to another edition of Nobody Told Me That. For today's episode, I thought I would revisit a topic from years ago. It recently came up in a class, and I thought, you know what? It's been a while since we've tackled this particular topic. It's patient termination, and although it is a part of our revenue cycle and how we manage it, it's really a bummer to handle. It's money we didn't collect. It's not a fun topic for me because I don't like to admit that I couldn't handle the actual collection of the account, but it is a topic that we need to know how to handle should we have to be faced with it. So let's deep dive into it. Why would we terminate a patient, first of all, and how do we handle the process? Most of us who work at the front know that some patients really don't need to be in our practice. We all have opinions on this, right? They don't deserve to be there, and they really just don't do any good. They don't bring any new patients. They're terrible, hard to handle, all of that. They miss appointments, they don't pay their bills, and so on. A lot of times, the doctors are not the ones who see the bad side of the patient. It makes that even harder for them to understand that we do need to get rid of patients. And it's hard for them to accept because, in their eyes, once a patient is always a patient. But from an administrative point of view, the patient, it is the lifeblood of the practice. When you're a business owner, it really bothers you, or a business leader, really bothers you to lose one of those vital drops of lifeblood. I get it. It's like the worst breakup imaginable with no hope of reconciliation. So I totally understand. When should you absolutely terminate a patient, however? First of all, if a patient is unnecessarily rude to my staff, the doctor, anyone in the practice, or even another patient, that's happened, being out in the waiting room, sometimes some conversations happen. And when I say rude, I'm not talking about the fact that they didn't hold the door, or maybe they accidentally bumped into someone on the way out. That's not what I'm talking about. I mean, they were beyond embarrassing. They attacked maybe you, they attacked one of your coworkers, they made your team members feel really small. This is something that we have to pay attention to as owners and managers. When a patient is unnecessarily rude to your employees, that puts us in a position to understand that we have to take care of our employees, right? You have this situation happening. We as business owners have to respond to that. One of the responsibilities of the job is that we have people under us and we're responsible for their safety and for providing a safe workplace. When you have a patient who is very rude and even borderline violent, you have a duty to protect your employees from that patient. If a patient becomes violent, that's a situation where I don't even think twice about this. Not only am I scared, but I'm not going to think twice about terminating them because I need to protect my practice, right? In cases of any expressed violence, like say they make a threat to you, you do need to call the authorities as there could be potential assault charges involved. If anything happens to your employee afterwards, there might be issues if you did not step up to protect them. It is, remember, your responsibility to provide a safe working environment as a business owner. Now, I'm not an HR expert, so I'm not going to delve too much into that, but you can go back to previous podcast episodes where we talked to Dwayne Tinker about workplace violence and how to handle that. And I also know from my experience with HR companies that these are serious issues we face. It's something that nobody told me about that can happen when we're not paying attention. Patients are usually not happy when we give them unexpected balances or when they're in pain. This actually is very common. Something else that arises is patients who actually make us very uncomfortable. Perhaps you have a patient who has flirted with you or a team member and just has that creepy vibe. Most of us women understand this, and probably even some of your men, right? We don't want to be alone with this person. When your employees express this type of discomfort when they're treating a patient, you have to listen to that. You yourself probably don't want to work on someone you felt uncomfortable with, so I get that. And we know some of our patients are just not pleasant to be around. And if this discomfort affects the employee's ability to perform their job, well, we need to pay attention. Instead of being open and accommodating to the patient, I think sometimes we have to flip that around, right? We sometimes must open our arms to our employees and prioritize their well being. As somebody who has been on the other side of that, I remember having my doctor stand up for me and making sure that we didn't see that patient again. Or remember, there was one patient for our hygienist that we actually never scheduled on the days when she was working. The patient was not someone we wanted to let go as a long-term patient, but we definitely wanted to make sure that that employee never had any conversations with them. So those are the main reasons I would immediately terminate a patient without hesitation. Now, another fundamental rule of collections, so let's go to revenue cycle piece, is that when you send someone to collections for not paying their bill, we also need to terminate them as a patient. Now, that's another reason I am having no issues with getting rid of a patient, with terminating a patient. If we went through all the steps, we went over our financial guidelines, we attempted to collect the balance, and unfortunately we were unable to do so, then sending them to collections is absolutely necessary. One thing to keep in mind is that if you threaten to send a patient to collections, you really actually cannot do that repeatedly. So there's actually laws about that. So if you send a patient to collections or threaten to, you don't follow through, that's actually considered harassment. I plan on having some accounts receivable experts coming onto the podcast at some point so we can discuss this, because I know that this is something that a lot of people use as sort of a, almost like a prod to pay the bill, but you can't continually threaten someone with collections. You only really have that one chance to do it. If a patient is not going to pay their bill, we need to send them a letter, and we also need to document how often we're contacting them about it. Well, thankfully, you are able to do that with your electronic systems because we are able to track how often we're sending them statements and did they even open the email if we sent it to them via email. I had a secret weapon actually, and it was a form that was called the authorization to file suit. It was a triplicate form. And for those of you that were born after the year 2000 and have never seen this type of thing, triplicate means 3 copies of it. So you could press through the paper and basically fill out this form all on one. So the top form would go to the patient. Then I would keep one of the other ones for my records. And then the third one would go to the collections agency that I'm using. Now, basically, whenever I sent that letter to a patient, it would say right on it, notice of authorization to file suit. Well, that was always a huge wake up call. And I had lots and lots of success with patients paying their bill when they received that type of letter. So unfortunately, the environment of practicing today means that the collections laws around healthcare are just very different than they were 10 or 15 years ago. Medical bankruptcy, medical delinquency, and healthcare, their bills, the billing and the laws around them have changed a lot. I'm not going to go off topic, but there have been many changes, and it's not as easy, or actually it's not as shameful as it used to be. It doesn't affect your credit like it used to. And so a lot of people are realizing that it doesn't hit their credit, and they actually count on that. And so if you know that it's not going to hit your credit, if you're a shady type of person, what's basically going to happen is they're not going to pay their bill. So when I send the collections letter to them and inform them that it's going to an agency, that is the point when I send a termination letter to them to let them know that we no longer want them in the office. Now, when you send the notice of authorization to file suit, that's kind of like shots fired, right? Most patients don't come back after they see that because it's a very legal looking type of letter. And you can have your print company do that. You don't even have to have it in triplicate, but basically you can come up with a form that says that. I can always link to a copy of it in the show notes so that you know what I'm talking about. Now, let's get back to the termination letter. So the letter that you're sending states that they have 30 days to visit your office to complete any work they wish to have done and it's on a cash only basis. Now, here's the essential part. We should never, ever leave a patient in an irreversible state. So you may send someone to collections in the middle of working on a crown, but you have to deliver the crown. You can't hold on to the crown because they didn't pay their bill. That's leaving them. It's a definition of leaving them in an irreversible state, right? So I hope that makes sense. We can't withhold records too. That's another thing that we'll get into. So because of this, we need to, if you know you're going to be sending somebody to collections, we need to stop treatment at a point that doesn't leave them in a worse state than before. And if somebody is delinquent paying their bill, like say they have a huge treatment plan and they're already defaulting on the first 5,000 of it, don't push and schedule those extra appointments. That's it. Call it a day. So complete the existing treatment and basically don't talk to them about completing more treatment. The more you make appointments for them, that's actually enabling them not paying the bill. So deliver the crown, deliver the partial, whatever you're doing, but don't start anything else unless they can pay you on a cash only basis. Okay, so that's the important thing. Many of us feel that our PPO contracts aren't going to allow us to do that. We have to file, we have to do this, we have to do that. However, there's a clause in all of these contracts that says the office must make an attempt to collect from the patient. This is part of your attempts to collect from them. Now, I'm not suggesting that you use this as a loophole, right? That's not the intent of it. But if you reach the point of sending them to collections, I'm going to guess that you have done everything that you can in your protocol. So your protocol of giving them 30 days on a cash only basis, if it's part of your financial policy, that is considered part of your collections process, and you are allowed to do that. In my experience, we rarely have patients come in to finish any work during that 30-day period. They just get that letter, and I think most of them already know that they're not going to pay this bill. They could be embarrassed, they could be angry, they may simply not have the cash for treatment. Whatever the reason is, we provided them an option and they chose to not take it, which is fine with me because now, I'm not going to get emotional about it. Now I just need to know what to do. So I send the termination letter certified. I attach a return receipt request so I can make sure that I know when it arrives. And if it comes back to me because they didn't pick it up, I scan it into my records. I keep a record of the fact that they didn't pick up their forms if they request their forms. If this goes to small claims court or elsewhere, the fact that they didn't pick it up could help your case. Your collection agency would like to know that you had no contact with them as well. It could mean that they changed addresses, they moved out of town, and collection agencies typically can do what we call a skip trace. One question that I receive in management classes is whether we have to give them their records. Yes, you do. They own the records, right? I know we're holding them. It feels like we own them because we're holding them, but you don't. They're their records. And honestly, why would you want to keep them? It seems petty, but you know what? I understand pettiness. I get it. We might feel this way because the person didn't pay their bill and we worked really hard to collect it. I chuckle a little bit at that because I understand, but we have to give them their records. Now, in your documentation, there is probably a section to record missed appointments, canceled appointments, or treatment non-compliance, okay? Those are actually clinical notes. And I know if you've heard me speak recently, you know that I'm very passionate about if the patient decides to not move forward with treatment, that's a clinical note. But we don't include financial information in clinical notes. So the fact that they defaulted on a bill, that doesn't belong in clinical, but missing an appointment, no showing for an appointment, and even late cancellations, those are clinical notes because those are actions by the patient that affects the treatment. The treatment could have been provided, but it wasn't due to the patient's what they call lack of participation in their own care. Now, collection agencies and lawyers use this concept frequently, so don't get upset about the records if they request them. Just send them. Sometimes people get sent to collections for reasons beyond their control. I get it. But we all know those who are aware of what they're doing. And I appreciate the sentiment behind wanting to hold on to the records. I appreciate that question because I get it. Additionally, I want you to review the rules on your malpractice site with your doctor and also the admin team in case they get this request from a patient and then they know how to handle it. Now, every dentist has malpractice insurance. We all know that. And there is usually a special section on the websites that covers terminating a patient. And in fact, many of the malpractice attorneys, if you go to listen to them lecture, they actually will tell you that a patient who is really angry about a bill, actually, that can a lot of times turn into a malpractice suit. So, when a patient gets this, they take it personally. I mean, who wouldn't, right? They may decide to sue you because they're unhappy with the treatment provided. What they're really unhappy about is the bill. But it is a very common cause of dental lawsuits. And lawyers often mention this, like I said, in the classes when they share their war stories. If they do file suit for that, that's definitely something your malpractice attorney is going to very much appreciate, that you kept notes on the fact that they didn't keep their appointment or that they were late with their payment. Again, not in the clinical, but in the patient record. And so what I would love for you to do is making sure that you could take a class, actually. Well, let me back up. That's why I'm going to urge you to check your malpractice attorney site and just make sure that you're documenting everything basically to their level, so that should they have to defend you in court, they'll have everything that they need in order to do that. Now, if you've attended any of my coding classes, you know that I like to say that, of course, documentation drives revenue. That's kind of my tagline. I know it's nerdy, but it's actually my tagline. We need to document not just to the level of the insurance carriers, which is definitely a common misconception. And you've heard me say this. While it's important to get the claims paid, my primary goal as your manager is to keep the doors open and to ensure that patients can continue to keep receiving care from us. So that means really making sure that you don't lose your license, because I want to make sure if there's any audits that you can withstand them all. So my standard for documentation is not to the level of the carriers, even though I focus on getting benefits from the carriers. But my standard for documentation is to the attorney or the jury that's reviewing your records. Now, keep in mind, that's a different and a more rigid standard. We often just think about getting our claims paid, which is great. I love getting claims paid. You know that. But I also want to ensure that we are documenting legally and to avoid repercussions, really, should it ever come back to us. There is no reason, actually, a patient should come back and be able to say, oh, look at this gap in your documentation. It actually wouldn't even be the patient saying that. It would be the patient's lawyer, which is really no fun. So remember, if it wasn't documented, it didn't happen. And unfortunately, this is a situation many dentists find themselves facing. And maybe they just weren't aware, but I think now with so many malpractice carriers requiring you to take classes on this, then I think it's hard to get past that piece of information. So let's talk a little bit about account cleanup. So once you dismiss a patient, you have to make sure in your system that they are flagged as a collections patient in your software. Change their name to all caps, add 2 stars to the front of their name, change their payment types, whatever you can do in your system to make sure that they stand out. What I want to happen is if anyone were to click on their name, they would be aware that that person is a collections patient and we don't want to schedule appointments. So a new employee who hasn't been told about this actually very commonly is going to mistakenly schedule the patient again. And that's always a hassle. It's happened in my offices. It's happened, to me. I hope it doesn't happen to you. Maybe there's an alert that you could put on their account, some notification that says, do not schedule, owes a lot of money, whatever it is, or talk to Teresa. That could be another thing. Ensure that something is set up so the patient doesn't end up back in your system because you've dismissed them from your system. So now here comes the uncomfortable part. What if this patient calls you, or even worse, you see them out in the wild? Ugh. This happened to me once. I was in a restaurant and I saw someone I had sent to collections and I had forgotten all about it. It'd been like 2 years and I couldn't understand why she was being so mean and just angry face with me, right? And then it hit me. And I was just trying to melt back into my seat and slip out the back door when I remembered, because I'm out trying to have a good time. And here she is shooting daggers at me from across the room. It happens. Some of us live in small towns and, frequently see patients, not in a small town, but managed to see her. It's not ideal that I ran into her, but it's also truly not my problem because she didn't pay her bill. And that's something she's going to have to deal with, especially when she's applying for loans or mortgages. And I'm not sitting here in shame that I didn't pay my bill, right? She is. Old school admin people, actually like myself, always have stories about patients who finally paid their bill because they needed to buy a house. Now, back in the day, you don't notice that anymore because there's been changes in the collections laws, like I said, and there's not really a big hit on your credit score. But back in the day when a patient was applying for a house or a loan, they would run a credit check. And if I had sent them to collections, they would have to come and pay their bill in order to qualify for the home loan. So it was very common. The patients would come in, or even if they've moved like across the country, they would say, I think I owe you some money. I really need this house loan. I would say, and I wouldn't say anything snarky because it's not, who cares really, but I was just so happy to get paid. But definitely that used to happen a lot more. Nowadays, you don't have that burden to clear the credit score. That's actually kind of sad because I think a lot of people who have medical debt understand that. But getting back to the confrontation here, it's definitely uncomfortable when the patient's in front of you and they're peppering you with questions about why they were dismissed. So let's go over some conversation skills and how that is going to come into play here. So maintain a steady voice and breathe. First of all, breathe. Okay. It's important during any uncomfortable conversation. Honestly, you need to maintain control of the conversation. If you've heard any of my management classes, we talk a lot about how crucial it is to control the conversation. And I'm really talking about the conversation with the employee, but in this case, obviously, we're talking about the patient. With employees, we can always reschedule the conversation, but we can't do that with patients. It's on you to breathe through this because, again, it's uncomfortable. And if you're in public, it's weird, right? People are looking at you. Our natural tendency might be to raise our voices, but that's just not going to help. Keep your tone calm. See if you can move them into a private area and let them know, I'm sorry, this didn't work out. We tried to work with you, but it just doesn't seem like it was a good fit for you and me, our practice. Have a few of those go-to lines ready. You could even practice telling them, why don't I call you? Let me have a good number. Let me call you and maybe we can arrange to take care of this at the office, but I really don't want to handle this in person. This is not something that I feel comfortable doing. And of course, they're going to come back with, well, I don't care if you're uncomfortable. Well, you know what? It's fine that you don't care, but I care. So, and again, I'm not going to be snarky. That was my inside voice right there. But I would say, honestly, I cannot discuss this with you in public with people listening. You could use that tactic with them. Maybe you could get them to call the office tomorrow if you're not comfortable taking their information, whatever it is. But honestly, it's going to be uncomfortable. I will tell you that. I definitely have been in this situation. For example, we wish it could have been a better outcome, Mrs. Jones, but I really think you're going to be happy in another office. Let's just take care of this and then we can both go on our way. Other things I've said is, it seems like you're having issues with how we run our practice and we don't want that. We want you to be with an office that's a good fit. We want to have patients where it's a good fit for us too. It just feels like a mismatch. And I have said that exact line, you in our office, it really just feels like a mismatch. That's what I have said in the past. And it's not a judgment on the patient. I mean, inside voice maybe, but it's really not a judgment on the patient. Some patients operate at a totally different speed. You have seen that yourself. They expect us to do all sorts of crazy things. And you know what? Maybe there is an office out there that could accommodate them. So all of these things that I said, they may sound a little cliche and they might sound weird, but if you practice it, the more you say it, and the more you stick to it, the more natural these types of conversations are going to feel. When faced with an angry patient, that's not the time to rely on like quick wit or debate skills, right? Because it just is going to escalate. Have your go phrases ready so that you're prepared. I wish we could have made this work. Dr. Jones realizes this was not an easy decision for any of us. He wishes it had gone differently. It just seems like this practice isn't the right fit for you. We're sorry we couldn't meet your needs financially. I'm just giving you a couple different go-to lines. And no, they're not going to make anybody happy, but they are handy to have in the back pocket so that you are ready to go. Have these phrases memorized, right? For the veterans among you, you may even have phrases that you think work even better. Share those with your team. They're the ones who are going to need to practice them because, God forbid, managers, you take a vacation and somebody else is going to have to deal with angry Emily when she comes in. I really want our teams to be ready for these situations, and it would be nice to handle them a lot more smoothly than if they had to do it on their own. So maybe even in a meeting, just review these key points with your team, listen to this episode again, take some notes, maybe hold a meeting to discuss the protocols, particularly regarding these conversations. I know that in a lot of offices, the default is just kick it up to the office manager and let her handle it or him handle it. And I understand that and I'm fine with that. But again, everybody in the office needs to know how you would handle it so that if something were to go sideways, maybe you're not working that day, somebody else could pick up there. So
just a reminder to check out the companies who support the show. My friends at Synergy Dental Partners are offering 2 free months to try out their lower prices for labs, supplies, and select software services. To sign up, visit odysseymgmt.com/synergy, and the link is also in the show notes.
For your clinical team members and your doctors, it's always good to discuss the language to use because they definitely don't want to have this conversation. So, for example, I'm going to pass this back to Susan up front because this is something that she deals with all the time. I'm going to let Kay handle this. She knows the finances here inside out. Call the office, let them handle it. I don't want my doctors getting into disputes with patients who owe money. It's just a bad look all around. And that's why they hire you and me, right? So we're the ones who are trying to protect them from these types of conversations. So make sure to talk to your team about it, review the protocols, again, check your malpractice sites for guidance. If your doctor hasn't taken a course on record keeping from a malpractice attorney recently, I urge you to do so. Many states actually mandate it. Never hurts to take a refresher course. It's actually a really beneficial class for you to attend, managers. It's going to help you become an even better leader, but you'll also be aware of all these situations that could come up. The most fun thing about some of these classes is that they do share a lot of their war stories, and it's really wild how nuts some of these patients can be, right? So if you do send a letter, remember to send it certified, get the return receipt, make sure to give the patients their records. Don't worry about it. Don't complain. Don't push back. Just hand them over. The best part, actually, of giving them their records is that they're now in the patient's hands and they are out of your office. So celebrate a little with that. Make sure to breathe during these situations, right? Don't lose control of it. The first few times you terminate a patient relationship, it's going to be tough. You're essentially telling the patient, we don't want you here anymore. That's what they're hearing. And there's judgment. They're hearing judgment, right? So it's a difficult message to convey. Nobody wants to hear it, whether it's you or the patient. However, you have to do what's right for your office to ensure that your team is protected, right? That make sure that your team doesn't have to deal with anybody who's threatening. Your office is protected. Your bills are going to be paid. Your doctor is protected too. Being a firm manager when it comes to terminating patients, it's going to pay off because your team is going to trust your judgment, as will your doctor. There's no favoritism here. There's no, well, what about this and what about that? You're going to be consistent on that front when you set down the reasons for when you would terminate a patient. And I think your employees are actually going to be very relieved to know that if you do have any situations with a patient that comes in and they feel threatened, I think they're going to be really happy to hear that you're going to have their back. And so I definitely think it's a tender topic, but it's a necessary topic to go into. So that is my deep dive focus on terminating a patient. If you have suggestions for a deep dive like this, send along there's a contact form on the website. You can leave a YouTube comment, shoot me an email, and I will research it and get it to you. They're always good topics for these podcasts. So until the next time, dear listeners, I always, always appreciate that you spend your time with me.
We're all super busy, so thank you for making time for me today. The show notes will have any links that we referenced in the episode. You can also find links for my book, events, and my online insurance course, Dental Insurance Design and Management. I speak often around the country on management and insurance issues. Come hang out with me in one of my classes. I promise you'll laugh and learn.